I wanted to share with you guys what I do for my Bible interpretation using hermeneutics. You can find this on Dr. Bob Utley's website. He's a professor in hermeneutics for years. He now offers all this stuff free on his website, freebiblecommentary.org. You can find this under the section called Good Bible Reading. Basically, this is the methodology for doing his form of hermeneutics. This derives from the School of Antioch. There was two schools back in the early church. We had the School of Alexandrian, which typically allegorized and spiritualized the text, and then you had the Church of Antioch, which says no, that you can't just spiritualize the text. There's a purpose behind the text. There's author's intent. There's all these things need to be taken into account, and that's what this methodology of hermeneutics tries to do. It's broken down real simple by cycle readings, or reading cycles. In the first reading cycle, you read the entire book in a single sitting. Then you read it again in a different translation. So if you start out with the first reading in the King James, or New King James, or NASB, or NRSV, those are word-for-word translations. When you read it again, you want to read it in a different a translation theory, something like a dynamic equivalent, which would be the TEV, or the NLT, or the JB. Those are called dynamic equivalent Bibles, and they're not so much concerned with the word for word, but they're concerned about getting the thought across. So some things don't translate over really well from Greek to English. So what the dynamic equivalents try to do is to try to capture the author's thought and portray it in English. So in the cases where the word for word just really doesn't get the substance of what the author was trying to say, because it doesn't come over really well going a word for word, the dynamic equivalent will pick up on that. NIV is another dynamic equivalent. Paraphrase. Taking a look at a paraphrase Bible, these are also helpful. So pretty much what I do is I'll first read it in the word for word, which is King James, New King James, and then I'll read it in the dynamic equivalent, which is like the NIV, the TEV, the NLT, something like that. Now, in this first reading cycle, you don't want to do too many things. You just want to kind of focus on one thing. That way, you don't get too many things on your plate. So, if you look for the central purpose in the entire writing, just try to identify that theme. And if you do that, you're doing really good. So just look for that one thing in your first reading cycle, and that will help you in your study of this book. What Dr. Bob Utley says, isolate if possible the literary unit, a chapter, a paragraph, or a sentence which clearly expresses the central purpose or theme. So what he's saying is isolate that one part, wherever you feel that one part in the book. So say you're taking the book of Colossians, and try to isolate that one part that you feel is the theme for the whole book, and note that. Say, okay, well, this paragraph or this chapter or this sentence seems to portray the real substance of what this book's about. And then this is real simple. You just identify the predominant literary genre. So like in that case, you're looking at New Testament, and that would be a letter or epistle. So if you're looking at the book of Colossians, it's a letter to the church in Colossae. So this is the first reading cycle. I will do a couple more videos on this, and we'll take a look at the next couple reading cycles and see if we can get a good solid approach to biblical interpretation using Dr. Bob Utley's hermeneutics. Alright, so we're at the second reading cycle of Dr. Bob Utley's method of hermeneutics from the School of Antioch. And if you haven't caught the first video, please go back, check out the first video. so you can follow the reading cycles. In the second reading cycle, what you're going to want to do is you're basically going to read the book again, but you're going to outline it. You're going to identify the major subjects in it, the major topics, and you're just going to do an outline of the book. And that's all you're doing in the second reading cycle. You don't want to do too many things at one time. It just makes it difficult. So doing one thing during one reading it just makes it easier for us to work with the text and to understand the text. If we try to look for too many things, it's easy to miss something. Which brings us to the third reading cycle. Now, at the third reading cycle, you're going to read the book again. So at this point, you've read the book at least 4 times, if not 5. And at this point, you're going to try to identify the historical setting of the book itself. You can list the historical items. Number 1 being the author, the date, the recipients, and the specific reason for writing. The aspects of the cultural setting that relate to the purpose of the writing, and the references to the historical people and events. Now, at this point, you're going to take your outline and you're going to expand your outline to paragraph level for that part of the biblical book you're interpreting. Always identify and outline the literary unit. So your literary unit may end up being several chapters. It may not be. But a literary unit, basically what that means is you're going through and you're expanding your outline to the paragraphs. And you're paragraphing the letter. Of course, this method of hermeneutics doesn't work well with, say, Psalms or Proverbs, because they're not really paragraphs. But this works great when you're doing when the genre is letters, pastoral letters or whatnot. So you're going through and you're paragraphing the book, and each, of course, you English teachers know every paragraph has a subject. So you're identifying the major subjects, and you're paragraphing it. For example, in my hermeneutics of the book of Colossians, I came to the conclusion after reading the book multiple times that I found one subject being thanksgiving and praise from Colossians chapter 1, verse 1 through verse 14. I found that when I got to verse 15, it seemed to start a new subject. So that's where I set up my paragraph. Now, when you're checking the historical setting, go ahead and grab an encyclopedia. Plenty of study Bibles have in their introductions the historical context, and all these things play a big part in hermeneutics, and they're very, very important to know, because you have to know the culture, you have to know the historical setting, you have to know the author's purpose. You need to know what his points are in writing this letter. All these will help us understand what we're reading, because when anybody tries to bring us some false interpretation that they read into their text, their eisegesis, you can go back and say, hey, well, wasn't the author's intent this? Well, if the author's intent is this, and we can agree that that was the author's intent, and what you're giving me is something contrary to the author's intent, then what you're doing is eisegesis, and you're reading out of context. So this doesn't necessarily teach you exactly what the interpretation of the text is, but it'll help you narrow down what is not the interpretation of a text. It's just a useful tool to help you do that. Alright, this is the fourth reading cycle. If you haven't caught the other videos, Biblical Hermeneutics 101, 102, this is video 103. If you haven't checked the first two out, go back and check them out. This is the fourth reading cycle of Dr. Bob Utley's method of hermeneutics. You can find this information on freebiblecommentary.org under the section Good Bible Reading. Now, this fourth reading cycle, basically you're narrowing down your hermeneutics to a specific literary unit. So what you're going to do is you go back to your outline and then what you have paragraphed in the letter. And for example, if we were using Colossians as an example, Colossians chapter 1 through 14 is what I came out with my literary unit. So I would go to that specific literary unit, and I would read that specific literary unit in multiple translations, starting out with the word for word, which is King James, New King James, NASB, NRSV, and then I would move to a dynamic equivalent like the TEV, the NLT, the Jerusalem Bible, and of course if you wanted to further that, you can go to a paraphrase, which is the Living and Amplified Bible. And in this, just from my experience, I mean, reading it in the multiple translations, like certain things jump out at you more. You don't even necessarily have to look at the marginal notes. You at this point you've become so familiar with the text that you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, or I mean, just red flags pop up in your reading of the text of things that just don't seem right, or and at that point you'll figure out, okay, well, this was found in this manuscript and it wasn't found in this manuscript, and that's why they translated it that certain way, and that sort of thing. Next, you're going to be looking at the literary grammatical structures, the repeated phrases, the repeated grammatical structures. You're going to be looking for significant terms, unusual terms, particularly difficult words, clauses, sentences. And this is the real important thing. You're going to want to look up the relevant parallel passages. Look for the clearest teaching passage on the subject you're using. Using a systematic theology, reference, concordance. Many Bible truths are presented in dialectical pairs. What that means is you have the Bible is Eastern literature. It's not Western literature, and you have to understand how they present truth. It's different than the way we present truth. And the writers of the New Testament, they were Hebrew thinkers writing in street Greek, and the way they presented truth is different than the way we present truth. We think completely different, and what they do is they throw up two seemingly paradoxical, seemingly opposite truths, and what you're to do is the truth is right in between those. For example, does the Bible teach predestination and free will? Well, the answer is yes. Where people get in trouble is they jump on one side of the fence when there's other scriptures that are on the other side of the fence, and the answer is right in the middle of both of them. And at this point, you're going to want to check your observations with study Bibles, Bible encyclopedias, handbooks, dictionaries, Bible introduction, commentaries. You want to bring in the information from God's people and what they found. The Bible is a final book of arbitration, so keep that in mind there. But it isn't until this point that you bring in these other things other than the Word. Your main focus is on the Word, reading the Word over and over and over, and in different translation theories, and it'll help you get grounded before you actually pick up a commentary or a systematic theology or something like that.